in case I'm brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. So we're recording now. Just a little bit of a pre-class. Yeah. Now it's. I guess it's horizontal, but it's what a weird. It's
Yeah,
kind of blocking you off.
I'm just using a phone right now because I'm in the middle of something.
Oh, okay. And you can't, even if you tilt it, it doesn't go. It doesn't go portrait mode or landscape mode.
This was the.
Oh, there you got it. You got it. That's what we wanted.
Oh, that's weird. Huh.
So what do you think, Scott? Here's the question. Relationship between something being cartoonish, or I think that implies childish or unsophisticated, versus when is it art? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, first, I think we need to remember that that word is a little strange, and that, you'll see something where it'll say cartoon by Raphael. Like what they were talking about cartoon versus what we think of cartoon are two different things. That was just any preparatory drawing back in the day. But as far as something today, it's like, oh, what is cartoonish? So it's got big round shapes and it's loopy and all that, what we think of as a cartoon in the Sunday comics. I think the word you used earlier in the unrecorded conversation is exactly the key. Is it predictable? I look at, say, a Rodin drawing and it's as round as anything. And I don't look at it and go, oh, this thing, it needs to be, it needs sharp edges and more detail or else it's cartoony. Something is cartoony when it is done with a system, when it's got an affected style, or it might have an affected style that's intentionally drawn in a very particular way that isn't responsive to a subject or to the painting. That's, to me, is when something looks cartoony.
Excellent. I think that's true. And I hear a lot of times like it looks like a comic book, or it's too, that's a real go-to kind of dismissal. I think a lot of people use, and I think a lot of times if the color is very unmediated, what would be a word for that? Or, it's what I would call sophisticated color is that it has relationships that are, again, unpredictable, subtle in a lot of ways. I think a lot of cartoony things just seem like they're not subtle. But yes, we're going to talk about predictability a lot today. I'm glad that you agree with me that that's...
Yeah, and it should be stated, we didn't talk about this ahead of time.
No, we haven't talked. Usually Scott and I talk like an hour a day. We haven't talked in a couple of days.
I know, I've been missing you.
Yeah.
But it's just the sophisticated color, and that you're not going to create sophisticated color or most of us aren't, if we just apply the colors straight out of our head without actually looking at what we're doing or responding to a subject or responding, well, again, to the painting. If you're just grabbing colors and throwing them down without any of that kind of, I'm just going to keep using that word, response.
Yeah.
That's when things they get predictable. I mean, and you can see it even in some atelier drawings where someone has learned some system by where, you emphasize intersections. Wherever there's a line from a leg hits a torso, and emphasize that. And so it becomes a system, and they've got all this, you can predict exactly where every line is going to be, how those lines are going to flow, what the shapes are going to be like. Everything is suddenly very predictable, and it doesn't feel real, even though they've drawn the fingernails.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that actually, now that you said that, I'm just going to keep this, let's just keep going on the class for a minute, because what you guys are seeing here, remember, is that this is today's micro lesson we're going to combine the idea of line, which to me is a very important subject in composition. We're going to talk about repetition, and that kind of means like predictability or surprise. I'm going to show you some examples, and we're going to kind of use the ideas of time and space, how we move through an image. And so I've got some photographs here of paintings that I want to share with you guys. And kind of, Scott, it would be great to get your feedback, because there's a guy who's perfect for this conversation, whether it is, quote, cartoony, illustrative, graphic design, Wayne Thiebaud. And Wayne Thiebaud's kind of the perfect guy to discuss the topic of line, because he uses it in two of the four ways we're really going to talk about. The first way, he uses it as a path, line as a path. Secondly, he uses it as boundaries. He really emphasizes the boundaries between the objects and their backgrounds, things like that. So this week, we're just going to focus mostly on the first idea of line, that it is a path for the eye to go along, actually I looked it up, the etymology, the word history of line is rope. The word that it's closest to is rope. And I thought that what a great conceptual device to think about a composition as it's a rope that goes through. Yes, sure, somebody's called this. People wait to call me until we're right in the middle of class. And so let's look at a few Wayne Thiebaud's. And Scott, if you're still interested in chatting about this, I'd love to hear. We've never talked about Wayne Thiebaud, and I'd love to hear how you kind of categorize him as either like an illustrator or a pop artist. He often is referred to. He considers himself an illustrator. What do you think about Wayne Thiebaud?
Thiebaud is, in so many ways, I use him to show people that how the rules are arbitrary to some extent. That this is cartoony in some ways. There's the lines have a certain weight. There's it's very intentional, but somehow it works. I mean, there's thinking about composition, how all the intervals, all the spaces between those hammers, every shape is different.
Yes, and he's a master at doing those tiny, so this is what I was kind of trying to squeeze out, and you just hit it. Nail on the hammer on the nail, so to speak. It's that there's a degree of predictability in that the subject matter is repetitive, but then there's another degree of surprise in the variation from item to item. And I think that's sort of what, that to me, Sarah Sally Bees is one of the crucial differences between being cartoony and being whatever we would call art. Is my response to it is much more engaged and involved when it's got that variety and it's not just the same hammer 5 times.
Right, and I would add that it's the sort of the spectrum from art to cartoon. I mean, first are we going to argue that a cartoon is not a form of art? I don't think so. But in terms of painting and the stuff that we seem to be interested in, it crosses. There's a spectrum there. No, I don't know that anyone's going to hold up a family circus, well, for any reason. But we're not looking to that for the kind of sophistication that we see in this Thiebaud.
Yeah, and there's the word again, sophistication. And I think, so to me, the Simpsons, at least back in its heyday, are very sophisticated. It's they're using cartooning as a device to kind of lower your guard, and then they lay all this sort of adult humor and references and really smart turns of phrase and things like that. And so you get, I've talked about this a million times, you get the one side of childish, cartoonish, and you get the other side of sophistication. And when you pull those together, it becomes a much more satisfying experience. Let's look at another one here. This is totally improv right now, by the way. What are you working on there, Scott? Speaking of cartoons, you got a nice bright colored piece going there.
I'm trying to find a blue that doesn't exist. That's what I'm doing.
Isn't that tricky? Yeah, when you get to that spectrum, that it just isn't going to get you there. So like this, again, there's a repetition. Note, pay attention to the repeating parts, and your eye is moving along a path. For me, the path kind of goes up the left side, down the right side, and then back up up the left side, down the middle, and then back up on the right. But notice the tiny little variations. In fact, I've got this in Procreate. Let's look at it. So the variety just from like shape to shape, there's just a slight tilting, like it's not all exactly the same. And then there's this thing right there, total sort of left field color relative to what else is happening. Same, even these within these shadows, there's variety, there's repetition, but it's not just over and over and over again the exact same thing. I feel like it makes it more interesting. Scott, this is great. Let me just tell you, Scott, my fantasy about all of this has been, you're there painting and I can just ask you a question, and then soon I'll be here painting too. And, we can help each other, like switch cameras. And then some of you students, you guys can jump in and we can see you in your studio. This is what I love about doing this stuff. And soon I'll have students in the class so that when I ask a question, it's not just dead air. Like, what do you guys think about that? And then nothing. So anyway, the principle today, the micro principle, and we'll look at it a few different ways, is the idea of line as a path. we're going to talk about line as a border next week. But what I want you guys to start thinking about, and let's have the chat about our forum. I apologize that right now Facebook's the only way I have to do that. I wish we had our own website. I wish I had my own website that I could host a forum and we could do it on there. And I know, I've got the same concerns with Facebook that you guys have got. But for now, that's where we're going to be posting this stuff. And what I want you to do this week is start thinking about how the eye moves when something is repeated. And so I'll give you a couple of different examples. Sometimes the eye moves very slowly and methodically. And I think in this piece, it doesn't have a lot of dynamic, swoopy, swirly, twisty-turny type of motion. It's very much something I heard explained once, the march of an elephant. It's this foot, that foot, this foot, that foot, and it just goes on. It kind of plods along, versus something like this Egon Schiele. It's much more reactive. It's much more dynamic. Your eye, there's lots of places for your eye to go, lots of places for your eye to stop. Oh, did that come up a little bit late? I think there was a bit of a delay there. Lots of twisty, turny, twirly, swirly type stuff. But think again of the repetition. There's a certain repetition of certain shapes. The hair and the calf, for instance, both of the calves have a lot of the same kind of angles that are in the hair, but there's just enough then variation as your eye's moving around through that to have it remain interesting and to have it be what I would call sophisticated. Let's look at another here. One of the all-time great line-based artists, Giacometti. What do you think, Scott? Throw me a little opinion. What do you think of Giacometti?
Oh, I think he's fantastic. I think he is, for me, he was maybe the most pivotal artist, or second most pivotal artist in me understanding how I wanted to paint and what I wanted to do.
So elaborate on that. What did you take from him?
That painting was about the process and about having a conversation with the subject and with the painting itself. And it wasn't just this linear progression from, all right, block in and work your way to fine detail, ta-da, you're done. Mm-hmm. That it was, and that when he was creating, especially in his drawings and paintings, creating such an amazing sense of space and form and volume and presence, he wasn't doing it with what I had long thought were the tools by which you do that, with light and value and color, that it was something else was happening.
Yeah, that's actually, I have a very similar, I think you and I, Scott, probably grew up primarily drawing. I don't know if that's true. I didn't start painting till college. I was a drawer. And so for me, Giacometti was the first time I saw something that looked like drawing. I mean, his drawings obviously look like drawings too, but his sculptures look like drawings. Like they're drawings that have come into the 3D world. And I've always been really fascinated and intrigued. And somebody's asking, Karen wants to know who's the #1 most pivotal. It's me, isn't it? Am I the #1 most pivotal artist?
Clearly. I mean, I saw your snowscapes painted a dozen years ago, and I decided that I should never paint again. Andrew Wyeth. Well, the Wyeth family, just because I grew up in that part of the country and just marinated in Wyeth since I was a wee little kid.
Yes, that Wyeth is another. And what I love about Wyeth, we've talked about this, that I went through a phase of wanting to be a kind of high-minded artist. And so I dismissed Norman Rockwell, Wyeth, Hopper, that's all kitsch, that sort of stuff. And even after I had gone many months and possibly a few years of dismissing them, when I came back to them, it was like coming home to something. It just made so much sense. And I felt so, like kind of prodigal son returning to something that was really good. And I can never get enough of Wyeth.
To go back to the first question of cartoon or not, if you go to Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, you will find galleries showing paintings of barns that have been painted in sort of the Wyeth style by people that just like what he does. And they're cartoons.
Yep.
They are facsimiles of what he was doing. They're not an actual, from my point of view, sort of an honest response to a subject, which is, to me, what he does or did so amazingly was that what he was doing was so authentic to himself and his experiences, that they weren't cartoons. And everyone else sort of was like, I'm going to do a Wyeth barn. Like, yeah, you have to do your own barn.
Yeah. Or, you know, who else you see that is Wolf Kahn. A lot of people like compare a Wolf Kahn to a copy of a Wolf Kahn or a imitation. And you can see immediately Wolf Kahn has that. I'm going to use the word attention, the thing that you're talking about with Wyeth too. You know, it's that focus, that attention, the kind of sophisticated, would say adult kind of approach versus the imitation that is much more just like, you know, how fast can I get this done? What, you know, whatever else is going through people's minds. But it's that formulaic, predictable, even the laying down of brushwork that you see it, and it's just like that was not something that somebody put slow, steady thought into. That's something that they said, here's what I'm going to do, and turned off their brain and just started doing it. At least I think that's what you're saying, Scott, something like that.
Something like that.
Well, elaborate if I'm missing it.
Yes, I agree. I haven't quite sorted out where there's how much thinking is problematic in making something. There's this strange line where you're both thinking and unthinking, and that's where to me the best work happens.
Yes, and so I'm going to throw this up there just to cause a little delight and a little dismay. Pay attention to how your eye moves. This is Joan Mitchell, one of my favorite artists, and another, like, pivotal. Speaking of pivotal painters, one of my kind of largest epiphanies was finally understanding Joan Mitchell. I used to dismiss her as somebody who appeared to be cleaning off her brushes. That's what I used when somebody would say, "What do you think of Joan Mitchell?" It looks like she's cleaning off her brushes on the canvas. Little did I know what she was really up to. But here, back to the idea, think about what's predictable. And I think, you know, when we get to color, we're going to use this again too, but there's a certain predictability in the color being similar. There's a certain predictability in the actual motion on, you know, the rope of the line that you're following. And then think about what is unpredictable. You know, those splotches on the bottom left, the kind of scrapey, scratchy turn, that middle. See, this is why I don't have my green screen, but usually I'd be able to point just like up at everything. That middle section where the intersection of the loop where it kind of breaks back into white. So when we start putting things in the forum, that will give us something to talk about next week. I want you guys to pay attention, either in your own work or in somebody else's work, about this idea of a predictable path, an unpredictable path, and the spectrum, as Scott is bringing up, that spectrum between those two sides and how to sort of navigate. So if you feel like Sarah Sally Bees, if you say to yourself, no, that was a lot of alliteration, wasn't it? If Sarah Sally Bees says to herself that something feels too cartoonish, it's probably because it's too predictable. And so you can fix that. Take something that is not expected and add that in there, you know, some splash or flash or you know, a scrape or scratch or whatever it's going to be, or a weird color or something like that. And that's to go back to my thing I talked about last week. My approach to teaching composition is not to help you match everything. I think that happens a lot. Like, you think, oh, I'm designing this, and so it has to all fit together really nicely in order for it to be good. And I think that's part of it, but there's so much of it that's then the breaking apart, the unexpected, and how to make that look good. That to me is sort of the essence of what I want to talk about. You can fill in, Scott, while I'm digging up another picture here, if you have any thoughts on that.
It's as simple as that. I agree. I often tell people that we as humans are just so good at wanting to organize things. I mean, it's arguably how so many ideas about how our world works comes from. Like, oh, I see a pattern there when there may not actually be a pattern. And I see people do that in paintings that may be too far, where they sort of make the painting equivalent of a tiled backsplash. Like, no, why is that not engaging? Oh, because you've made everything is the same.
Yeah, and it's funny, then there are some exceptions. I love minimalist art because of it's like so aggressively simple and repetitive that it puts me in a calm mental state. So there's that side. Here's a Morris Lewis. I don't think you can get more kind of formulaic and predictable than this, but for me, it still works. And I've got another to flash off against that one. And this, you guys, I appreciate everybody kind of sticking with me on this. I don't have an office right now, and I don't have a studio. Everything's under construction. And so I don't have a place to kind of get, to like get my center so that I can have all these things put together somewhere. But it's coming. This will be back to how it was before, pre-construction, very soon. So like this kind of a thing. That this would be a great one if we were all here in the room, that we could have this conversation. I do not feel, maybe Scott, you just take intentionally the opposite view and we can argue this. I do not feel like this is childish. And I feel like it's much more kind of primal and much more elemental. It's repetitive, but again, there's some variety in there. And there's just enough in there that is defying my expectation. This is Cy Twombly, by the way. There's just enough defying my expectation that it triggers me artistically. Scott, do you want to fight? Want to fight me about that?
I want to fight against you, but I'm having a hard time thinking about it because I really like this piece.
Oh, good. I'll see. This is just like we're a couple of Midwest dudes, like agreeing with each other about everything. What could be better?
Everything's fine, Mark. Everything's fine. All the paintings are fine. Everything's fine. No, there's even the again, thinking about that urge that we have to organize and tidy up, which is of course perhaps the exact opposite of who Twombly was. There is something very, as you say, primal about this. And everything is so different. Every line is a little different. You can feel the mark. You can feel the hand on the chalk.
Yeah, that's it for me too. There's something really satisfying to me about what I call haptic. The sense that you can imagine yourself making that piece, or you can imagine the artist. This, one of my favorite things about both Matisse and Dievenkorn is when you see them in person, you really get the feeling for how they put the paint on, and you can almost see like the size of the brush and the location of the stroke and the direction of the stroke, and it really pulls you into that piece, gives it a sense of, you can imagine who that artist is. Let's do one or two more. In fact, I had some demos I was going to show here. See if this part of why we're going off the rails too is I sent Scott a message, like an hour ago. I said, hey, there's a pretty good conversation going on Facebook. You want to come to class and we'll talk about it? And he obliged. So thanks, Scott, for coming through. And of course, the thing I was going to show, you see those two black squares up there on the upper left? That's what we were going to look at. And I don't know why that's not, like, I've never been in this situation where now my Procreate scene isn't opening. So I guess let's improvise. We'll go back to the pictures. I want to draw out this is sort of a somewhat hokey thing from Pinterest, but I think it's really instructive of what I want to talk about, the idea of the reason I'm using time as one of our discussions is that it's not just, a painting is not just, or a drawing, you look and then you go away. There's an element of revelation, slow discovery of what you're seeing. There's an element of movement through space. And this piece really, I think, kind of hammers that idea home. So when we start posting things, I'll sort of lead the charge. When we start posting things in our forum, this is what I want to talk about, is what are you responding to in your own work, in someone else's work, that is this kind of path. And it's a very obvious sense that we're moving from one place to another. There are little places that we stop. There are places that we move more quickly. And Sonia, I'll get to your question in a second because I know Scott's going to want to say a lot about this one. It's the N-word narrative. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you see that there's something. Look at the energy in this gorgeous little chair thing. And as we go forward next week, we're going to slowly transition into the relationship between line and shape, and that, as evidenced here by this, even this sort of a thing. We'll move into the combination of line, shape, finish, let's call it, or illusionistic parts, and having them coexist together. But line is such a great sort of base to start building everything, probably because we all probably started drawing before we started painting, or if we were drawing with a, with a paintbrush. And to me, still the root, I think of the cave paintings, I think of, just the entire history of Western approach to art. It's the cartoon that Scott was talking about, the preparatory drawing. It seems like everything we do kind of starts with that basis of drawing. And I don't mean academic skill. I mean like how a kid would draw as much as anything else. This is Alice Neal. Thank you, Christina. Sorry about that. And so, so Scott, not to make this a detour, but I think we can kind of pull this in. Sonia is wondering about, like with Rockwell, Hopper, Wyeth, that there's an element of narrative. And she's asking if we're going to get to that with time. I don't know. The problem with narrative is this is a composition class. I'll say that first. And I try to keep formalism as free of narrative as possible. If you've seen my paintings, I don't tend to paint very interesting subjects because I'm more interested in their relationships. But this is a narrative. This piece here has both of those things. It has a very structurally satisfying unpredictability, and it also has a kind of narrative attraction, or there's a draw. What's going on in this guy's head, and what's going on? So Scott, give us, maybe we can talk for 3 or 4 minutes. What's your grand philosophy of how to use narrative? How to, I know you've got a great answer to this.
I don't have a great answer. I do have something of an answer. Narrative, first off, every piece to me has a narrative quality. I mean, that's part of what you're talking about, the haptic sense, that you can see the hand making it. And so you're seeing this person's choices. And that's part of what makes a painting so transformative of a subject in a way that other mediums aren't always. That something very different happens, even when it's rendered photorealistically. I'm thinking about Wyeth and Hopper and such. There's one of the challenges that people had with Wyeth, maybe it's not what they struggled with Wyeth back in the day, though I think the controversy about Wyeth was way overblown by everyone to make it something to talk about, to sell magazines and whatever
it makes
else.
it more interesting. Yeah, I agree. Yes. Completely.
That his work had a narrative quality, clearly had a very literary quality. And it was at a time when work was very intentionally avoiding that kind of construct, that it was, you could see the narrative quality in how a mark was made, Twombly being a great example, but we're not supposed to actually connect anything that isn't subconscious to the image. Mm-hmm. And that to me is a very arbitrary line to cut, because that famous piece, Christina's World, that a figure laying in a field means something to us. So what are you going to do to make that not narrative? Just not be able to recognize it's a figure? Like, well, why not include those things? I mean, not that you have to, but it's just another tool. And to me, composition's a huge piece of how you make something successfully.
Oh yeah, and we've talked about this when we talk about Wyeth. The genius of Wyeth is that his compositions tell the story just as powerfully as his subject matter. So just the tension between the parts, the transitional spaces, all of that stuff. It's like musical. It'd be like the soundtrack of a film matching the scene perfectly. And it's the experience. I want to throw this in, Scott, and then you can elaborate on the narrative idea. For me, narrative is just another word for a kind of experience. The same way we'd say like art or formalism or something like that. Like, you don't have to project a narrative, even if the artist intended it. The narrative being a story. You guys know what narrative means. That the artist wanted you to have this kind of emotional response to the subject matter. Sometimes I don't even care. It's so, like I look at Anders Zorn and I'm so interested in the way he paints that I couldn't care less what he's actually putting in his pictures. Where vice versa, a piece like this, it almost implies some kind of subject, like a pile of rocks or something. This is de Kooning, by the way, that it implies something, but it kind of doesn't do it enough that I care. And so that experience, he's withholding that narrative experience, but he's implying it, if that makes sense. And I love that tension.
Well, and that to me is where, so ultimately, of course, you need to be painting the paintings that are, that you should be painting, for lack of a better phrase, that, you mark your work that what was the description? That what interests you is what your eye is drawn to. That is
Right.
those relationships of color and value and shape and all that. And so it would be strange for you to be like, all right, now, so this piece is about subjugation of this civilization back in.
Right. I would not do a political, like I have strong political views. I have never, other than in my kind of cartoony, you guys back to that, my cartooning, I love doing political stuff, but I've never tried to imply that in a painting just because, like you said, that's not what I'm interested in. Sorry to interrupt you, Scott.
And to me, that's when things are most interesting in a piece that has a narrative quality. I like to use the word literary quality.
Mm-hmm.
That they are not posters telling you to do something. That if you ask Andrew Wyeth, you read anything, any of his thoughts on any of his paintings, he will offer multiple versions of what he was trying to say.
Ah, funny.
Because that is, again, a very literary way of approaching a scene, an image, a subject. And it also means that there's so much there to be mined that wouldn't have happened if it was a, sign up now, enlist kind of poster. So I'm going to compare myself here to Wyeth for a moment.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. I don't know if you guys, can you see this at all?
Oh yeah, it's kind of small. The windows are small, what we're using here, but I can, here, you know what? I can make it really big. Give me a second.
This painting is, wait, my face is so large.
It's so handsome. It's so handsome.
It's so handsome. Thank you. We have a serious homeless problem situation here in Portland, and you see these blue tarps everywhere. And I saw somebody huddled in a blue tarp trying to stay warm. And it was just such a incongruous image. The plastic of the blue tarp against what was a sort of rolling landscape of hill behind this person. It's like, I want to paint that. And there was something about how sitting this thing on this place and this canvas that to me created the sense of a volcano, focused my eye here, and it created a bit of a narrative. But I'm not going to scribble, this man is homeless, donate now. It's not, while I believe in that, that's not what I'm interested in doing as an artist.
Well, and if I can chime in too, my formalist leanings are very satisfied by that piece because there's a lot, it's nicely centered. It's got a lot of graphic quality. The color is very impactful. The drawing, the proportions are really good. The movement, the path, so all of the formal elements are satisfying. The music of it is satisfying to me. And then when you say, let's say you name it, sleeper or something like that, that you just give a little implication of what that subject matter is going to be. And then that triggers the next response of like, oh, wow, there's a guy under there.
Right. And I am very interested in that story, and I'm interested in conveying that story, but I don't have a hard conclusion. And if I had a very firm conclusion, this is a story about the X and it means Y, suddenly I would just write that. I wouldn't make a painting.
So it's back to that unpredictability, the element of, I'm going to share a piece here, the element of leading somebody along a path, and at one point that path is comfortable, and at another point that path becomes uncomfortable, and you get to manage that relationship for the viewer. And I think that's, for me, I just need to say that a million times, because I do, when I'm in class and I'm doing a workshop or something like that, that's always kind of the thing the student tends to assume. My job is to make it pretty. My job is to make it make sense. And I think you said that, Scott, getting it to make sense. In the context of line and in repetition, there is room, if you have this hammer, then that hammer, then that hammer, and then you change the last hammer, that's going to trigger a response. If it's just going to be same, that's also going to trigger a response. So that's going to be our micro lesson this week. I'll put stuff on the Facebook page. I want to end, we'll do a little question answer too, but I want to end the kind of lesson with this image because it fits in perfectly with what we were just saying. This is an etching by Edward Hopper. And the title of this, Scott, do you know the title of this piece?
I don't recognize it, actually.
Yeah, it was something I dug up on Pinterest. The title is called The Suicide. And so there we go, right? That's, you've got your formalist elements, you've got your interaction of balance, you've got your repetition, the movement through the piece, you've got actual line and boundary, all of that sort of stuff, and then you throw the title on top of it, and it becomes a whole bigger, different sort of a thing. So I'm gonna, Scott, if you want to just say goodbye to everybody, we'll stay here. I'm gonna turn off the recording, but we'll stay and do, I'll at least do a little question and answer. I think Scott, you've done overtime. I appreciate it. I'll get you back on yours. Why don't you use this as a chance to pimp your workshop? Tell everybody what's coming up.
So I've got a online class starting up on February 26th, Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to be, this one's going to start with those core principles, those core underpinnings of painting, perception and inspiration, and how those two feed each other and can drive what we're doing as painters.
Yeah, and Scott, as you guys know who have been around while we do this, Scott's just a really fun, sorry, I'm gonna gush on you, Scott. It's just so much fun to listen to him talk about what he thinks about art, whether you agree with him or not. He just has very clear views, and he's very good at communicating. It's a very rare thing to be able to paint at his skill level and speak and think at his skill level. And so I'm going to give a little plug for it, that go take Scott's class. I'll be there, and I may not be there in voice, but I'll be hanging out. I may be there in voice if Scott gets how I was today. I get myself in a corner and I need somebody to help me get back out of it. But anyway, so thanks, Scott. Thank you, everybody. Next week, it's going to be line as boundary. And the reason I like to use the word boundary, I don't like the word edges, because edges kind of imply you have two choices: hard edge or soft edge. If you say boundary, now you're talking about the transition between two shapes, and the ease of permeability between those shapes. So a hard, sharp, dark line, for instance, will make it harder to get from shape to shape, where a value that's closer, even with that sharp edge, now you can get through that space easily. So the micro lesson of this week is going to be about repetition and the path of the eye. However you guys want to interpret this, the beauty of our forum on Facebook is once one thing will come up and then somebody will think of something else, and it kind of organically develops into this lesson outside of the class. It's going to be this lesson is going to be about line as it refers to repetition and movement of the eye. Next week, it's going to be about kind of the opposite, about line stopping the eye in different places. And we'll do line for a few weeks, and then we'll switch on to color or something, and then we'll do value and shape and all this other stuff. And let me put up one last image of this so everybody remembers what we're doing here today. So this was this is the format that we're using. I've got the elements there. I may adjust this soon, add a couple things, but rather than try to teach all of those things simultaneously, we're just going to do one little stream at a time. And this week it is line, repetition, through time and space. So thanks, Scott. If you guys want to hang out and do a little question and answer, I'll be here. We'll see you guys on the forum.
I'll hang out for a little bit too.
Oh, I think I hit a bad button. Hang on. I think I hit the wrong. Let's see.